So, hey everyone, today I want to take another look at Doom Eternal, its dead zones, as well as request quite a few options. This is pretty much identical to the video that I made right after the game's release, and nothing has really changed, except we did get a weapon wheel delay option. I will cover that in a little bit. As I mentioned there, most of the options that I'm going to be requesting are already exist as like console commands. They just need to be elevated to menu options so that console players have access to them. So to get into it, we have a 15% circular dead zone. 15% is on the lower end of default dead zones for recent games. So that's fine by itself, but there aren't any dead zone options available, so I'd like to request them. Using smaller dead zones can make precise adjustments easier, as well as just make aiming feel more responsive. But on the other hand, larger dead zones are useful for players whose sticks don't center properly and they want to avoid any kind of drift. So I think a range from 0 to 30% should cover everyone's preference, with single percent increments. These blue regions represent restricted diagonal movement, so I can make these bobbing motions, and in this case, the cursor will move perfectly horizontally. It is until you move into these green regions where you start seeing diagonal movement occur. This is most obvious when looking straight up or down. Where you can very clearly see when diagonal movement begins. I'd imagine this was implemented to try to make it easier for players to easily make perfectly horizontal and vertical movements, but what this does is make all your stick angles inaccurate to the cursor angles, because you could make about 20 degrees around each axis is only corresponding to one of 4 directions, and all your diagonals are scrunched in here, so you have to overcorrect to access them. And games with any kind of verticality, and even other games, kind of the system just breaks apart because of that. Like if you have demons over here, but then some demons down here, you have to overcorrect your angles to get the angle you want to make that adjustment properly. I would like to request options for this. If players are happy with this, that's great, but having an option would allow players to preserve the default, but be able to close up these sections so that players who want full diagonal movement can access that, and players who want, I guess, somewhere in between can do that as well. The console command has this value listed as 10, and that makes sense because it's 10 degrees between each quadrant, from each quadrant. So just having that option would allow players to control that to their preference. The acceleration curve, show that on screen. It does include the dead zone, so you can see from 0 to 15 there's nothing, and then the curve itself is actually a perfect quadratic curve, minus the acceleration jump. I had thought the acceleration jump was indicative of the outer dead zone, but it actually jumps, and then with more stick input increases a little more. It would be nice to get an option to control this acceleration curve. Quadratics give you, start out very slow and give you very easy access to precise movements, but for some players this might be too slow, and for some other players it might not be slow enough. So having a granular customization over the degree of this curve would be requested. So players who want a linear curve can access that by setting the degree to 1, and players that want something over can set that specifically to what they want. So a range from linear 1.0 to cubic 3.0 with 0.1 increments would be requested. That would give players a full range of really fine, uh, a way to really fine-tune the exact curve that they want. Now this acceleration jump, I think should also get an option. Some players don't like this little spike. It's a little difficult to see. If you kept the view, it's a little more obvious. You can see it's active there, not active, active, not active. It's about a 30% jump as is, but this can feel kind of awkward because there is a slight build-up for players, and having a fully consistent curve might be more preferable. So being able to disable this through an option would be requested, but some players might like to be able to even increase it so that they can play at lower sensitivities but with high output, high acceleration, turn acceleration, so that they can still turn very quickly. And this would work very well with the acceleration curve, so players wanting to play at a low sensitivity can play maybe linear curves with high turn acceleration, and some players want to play at a high sensitivity can do so with a more exponential curve with no turn acceleration. So that would really cater to both types of players. Lastly, for this would be the outer dead zone. It's at 1 currently, and for most people this would be fine, but having an option to control the outer dead zone would be useful for players whose sticks are failing and can't reach the edge of stick movement, and would allow them to keep playing and accessing the maximum turn rates available. So a slider for this ranging from like a 100%, the full range, to 80 or even 70% should take care of any possible issue players might have. The last aiming issue I want to speak on is the horizontal and vertical sensitivities are not the same. I don't think this is specifically a slider issue, though it's functionally ends up that way. But a more in the console commands, the vertical sensitivity is half of what or the vertical sensitivity is half of the horizontal sensitivity. Horizontal is 240 and vertical is the 120. Now with the sliders, it's not particularly clear just because 0 isn't true 0, so there's some offset, so the exact ratio might not be here. It might not be perfectly 50%. But what this does is, one, it's just unintuitive to have them set the same but then not have them be the same. Two is that differing axis sensitivities affects diagonal movement, and so I have them set the same here, but they're technically different. And as a very crude test for this, this door is relatively square, so if I move at a perfect 45-degree angle, you'd expect to meet at this corner. But if I do that, if I move at a perfect 45 degrees, you see that it falls short. And that's because the horizontal sensitivity is faster, and it's putting a bias towards that direction. I mean, this happens with any kind of ratio in any kind of game or almost every kind of game that has different axis ratios. So if we try this here, it's more vertically biased, so now the same input is very vertically biased. And the problem with it as it currently is you could fine tune it to try to get them the same and get correct diagonal movement that way. But just to be simple about it, like if you wanted them the same, and it was the vertical sensitivity was half, you'd have to double it to make them the same. The problem with that is that it forces you to play at no more than 50 sensitivity, or whatever the correct ratio is. So if you wanted to increase your sensitivity, you couldn't increase the vertical sensitivity any higher to preserve that ratio. So if you want to play at higher sensitivities, you have to play with incorrect diagonal movement. So correcting that value, just bumping the vertical value in the commands to 240, I'd imagine should fix this fine. So that way, if you set 80-80, you'd get horizontal and vertical the same at 80-80. Now, moving on to movement. So this red region represents the tested dead zone. So you can see when movement begins starting. It's not circular. It's rounded, but it does meet at these corners. Now I say tested because you can see lines under this dead zone, and you can see this little central region here, and that's because, I mean, note how there's no movement right here, but if I go on this slope right here, for example, and then past this, you can see that I'm sliding down it. Now this is possibly the true dead zone here, and it might be functioning differently here just because maybe there's the movement starts so slow, there's some movement friction or whatever, but and making this indicated region the functional dead zone, but for whatever reason that's just how it works. So you can't see movement beyond here, and you can't actually see the gun react when you pass through this dead zone. But in cases like this, the indicated dead zone is where it actually is, or where it functionally actually is. So the thresholds aren't circular, both for the dead zone, but this shaded region right here represents a jump in movement speed, and I'll get to that a little more just a bit. But there is restricted diagonal movement around the axes, and this is a little too difficult to show just as is. But if you're within the dead zone and you dash by default forward. To try to indicate this, if you are in this restricted region, your angles are being registered, so you can see that if I move backwards, I can dash backwards. But if I'm in a restricted region, this means that even though I'm pointing at an angle, I'm moving perfectly forward. But if I move into this angular region, I start moving diagonally. Now, the first request I'd just like to make is to make these is basically one, to make the movement dead zones perfectly circular. Like the dead zone should be circular, and whatever range should be circular. The camera ranges are perfectly circular, so that's great, but just bring up the movement controls up to that. But also the same options should be given, so options for the dead zone size, the outer dead zone, and the restricted diagonal movement, so that players can have full diagonal movement if they want it. Something I'd like to request is the movement curve. So I tested this from the tested dead zone, and you can see that it's not a smooth transition. It's a block of three kind of different linear curves. So from the dead zone to like 75%, then from then to like 90%, and then from 90% onward. So you just have three blocks of speed, and sort of like given how low the general sensitivity is, it's like you have no movement up until like 40 some, and then up through about 90 you have less than 30% of your movement speed, and then the rest of it just cranks in at the end. It'd be much nicer if from sort of this idealized true dead zone, this is about 23%, up until the outer dead zone was just a smooth linear curve. With these three blocks, it feels more like you just have like three modes of speed, and that's sort of like crude, like you're just emulating a keyboard with tiers of movement, where instead with a controller you should ideally have a nice smooth gradient. This is of course a bit of a petty issue, just because most players are going to be moving the stick fully and getting their maximum speed out, but this would add a huge layer of polish to the general controls, so players could, smoothly transition between speeds. So we don't need options, but yeah, just a smooth, for the curve, just a smooth linear curve is all that I'd request. Now the last thing, getting to the weapon wheel, so we got this delay option, and by default, before this option was added, it's 180, and then once that's the default for this option. I had originally requested this option, and from a range from 0 to 1 second, but the option we got was 70 to 500. Now the maximum of this is fine. 500 is like worlds of time, half seconds worlds of time in the game, but 70 is not 0. And the main problem I have with the wheel is the way the wheel works in this game is you tap the button, you get your previous weapon. You hold it, you bring out the wheel. Now, the issue with this is tapping the button lets you switch instantly between your previous weapon. Having to hold it means that the other 6 weapons have that delay, like you can't instantly access them. So that's why I requested an option for 0 milliseconds. And the problem with this implementation is if you try to, access the wheel too fast, a few things can happen. It's not exactly a flaw of this implementation, but it's just sort of punishing if, you make too fast inputs. So if you try to access the wheel too fast, one, the stick is still controlling the camera, so that's still going to be an issue. But if you move too fast, and if I try to, say, select the plasma rifle, which is down, you get your previous weapon, because it's a previous weapon input, like it's within that delay period. But you can also get dropped inputs if you point the stick in the direction, but it resets before the wheel actually comes out. And then since the wheel's out, you don't get your previous weapon input, and it just, functionally drops the input. This isn't the implementation specifically, but it punishes you for trying to, swap through the wheel too fast. And the issue is this greatly reduces that delay and mitigates some of those problems, but those problems are still there. Like you can still see, like I dropped that input, it registered there, but you also see that the camera input is still being registered. Some of these are dropping, some of these are registering, but all 3 of those issues have been demonstrated there. Now, I'd imagine they left this 70 millisecond there because they really wanted to prioritize this tap input. But the issue with this is that console players are still limited to 2 weapons. The point of getting a 0 millisecond instant weapon wheel, we lose this tap input, but then we gain instant access to all 8 of our weapons. If we want a previous weapon, we can just reselect it through the wheel. And this option should have catered to both types of players that want to use the tap input and players that want to use the wheel to access all their weapons instantly. But here, it's just a band-aid fix, and console players are still unable to do that. It's just a forced limitation. So this ideally should go to 0, and that would address this issue. The other thing is it'd be nice to have an option for which stick controls the wheel. So by default, it's the right bumper and the right stick controls it. But if you say if you prefer the wheel button on the left bumper, which I do and some other players do as well, the right stick no longer controls the wheel, but now the left stick does. This made sense in the official presets because it was bound to the Y button, where the left stick would be more comfortable without using a claw grip. But for something like the left bumper, the right stick still works perfectly, but it handicaps your movement with this. This is a console command, so ideally making it into a menu option would allow players to, set it to the left bumper, but choose to use the right stick to select things, and that would address that issue. The last thing I want to request is an option for VSync. This is a very rare option for console games, but for those unfamiliar, VSync syncs up the game's output frames to the monitor or TV output refresh, and that avoids screen tearing. Screen tearing is where 2 frames or a frame can be ready too early or too late, and it'll load in and kind of create a division in the screen, so you see 2 frames at once. and VSync allows address that issue. The problem is VSync introduces input latency, and that's the trade-off. So you can either choose to have screen tearing or input latency. And I think that console players should be given this option. I don't know exactly what the input latency for Doom Eternal is. Digital Foundry tested it for Doom 2016 and found 80 milliseconds, and that it feels comparable here. That's pretty hefty. Being able to use a lower input latency just helps the controls across the board, and it would be great to have the being able to disable VSync. We could still have the 60 frame cap for base models and 120 frame for caps for the current gen models, but it'd be just good to offer that level of control on, especially for like battle mode on PC. PC players will disable VSync almost whenever available, just to lower the input latency, and that certainly helps in competitive settings. Battle mode has had a lot of console-specific and separate console and PC balancing updates, and regardless of how much better people think a mouse and keyboard is to controllers, having things like uncustomizable dead zones, acceleration, restricted diagonal movement, limited vertical sensitivity, and limited weapon swapping on top of additional input latency that's not inherent to controllers or anything like that, is additional limitations that don't need to be there for console players. So being able to have these additional options and lower input latency would just straight increase the ability of console and controller players, and we would see just a straight benefit from that. Balancing around those limitations is just not giving a great idea of what the console player base is actually capable of. So just to sum everything up, I'd like to request for both sticks, it'd be good to have Deadzone options ranging from 0 to 30%. That should really cover, I think, everyone's preference. Outer dead zones, which could range from like maybe 70 or 80% to the current 100%. And restricted diagonal movement, ranging from the current 20 degrees around each axis to 0 degrees. For movement specifically, it'd be good to update that, update the dead zones to be, and thresholds to be perfectly circular and function as they do with the camera, just for consistency. For movement, changing the movement curve just to a smooth linear transition from the dead zone to the full speed. Options for the acceleration curve, ranging from linear to cubic, range of 1.0 to 3.1 would be requested. And then control over the acceleration jump, the turn acceleration, ranging from 1, which would be disabled, to 2 or even 3, just to let players really either increase their sensitivity, or if they play on low sensitivities, to be able to really fine-tune the way they want their acceleration to feel. Address the differing horizontal and vertical sensitivities. Hopefully it's just as simple a fix as taking that vertical sensitivity value and just bumping it up to 240 to match the horizontal one. That hopefully will fix it. And then for the weapon wheel, lowering the delay to 0 milliseconds, so that players who want to access the wheel instantly and all their weapons instantly can do so. One thing I forgot to mention is that with the wheel, you can actually switch the combat mods within the wheel, and if you're switching to a weapon, you can actually switch instantly through it. So faster access to the wheel means faster access to that, which could mean functionally instant mod swaps to the weapon you're selecting to. So that would be really good advantage to doing that. But yeah, so lowering that to 0 would make faster weapon swapping and access to all 8 of your weapons. The ability to choose which stick controls the weapon wheel, so that you can select any button you want and have it mapped to the without worrying about the stick automatically changing based on your bind. And lastly, VSync toggle, just to help lower the input latency on consoles and further bump the responsiveness of the general controls. So that's enough rambling. Hopefully we can see these things improved. Doom Eternal is a fantastic game, just as Doom 2016 was, but I think these issues really limit it from playing as well as it can on console and with controllers. So hopefully we're going to see the Horde mode update pretty soon. I doubt anything will change control-wise in that update, but hopefully there are still some updates to see these things implemented at some point. So thanks for watching, and everyone, have a good rest of your day.